Okay, we're going to start the first of our panels today. I must admit that Don has corrected my shoe tying also, and he's actually a very dangerous person to travel with because you get into a rental car and Don is controlling what's this do? What's this do? And the windshield wipers are going and that's going. And, he's always looking for better things. We have a series of panelists who have been involved in different phases of Don's life, and we're going to go quasi-historically, quasi-chronologically. But we're going to start with two short videos. The first one is going to be Jakob Nielsen. Jakob co-founded the Nielsen Norman Group with Don. And is in Japan right now. And so he sent a very short 1-minute video. The second video is from Jeff Elman. And Jeff has been absolutely fundamental to the starting of the design lab along with Pradeep. And Jeff, as many of you know, recently had a heart attack. And he's progressing incredibly well, and but he's not here with us today, but he, in usual Jeff fashion, had to be here in some form, so he made a really wonderful video that I think you will greatly enjoy. So let me play those videos. I'll keep the panelists in their seats so everyone can see it. And then I'm going to introduce all of them at once, and just to give you a feel for the people you're going to be hearing. So if we could play the first video with Jakob.
I'm Jakob Nielsen, and I want to say Don Norman is a hero. Don is a hero 3 times over. First, Don is a hero to the entire user experience profession, partly because he came up with that term, but actually more so because he came up with a lot of the theories and sort of deeper concepts that people are using to this day to think about user interfaces. Second, Don's a hero to humanity, because billions of people have a little bit better or easier lives every day because of better products that are designed based on these principles and theories that Don came up with. It's also amazing when you talk to people who are the leaders of the UX field, how many of them turn out to have been Don's students at one point or another, and again, using what he taught them to make these better products that make things better for so many, many people the world around. And third, Don is a hero to the Nielsen Norman Group because even though the two of us did start it together, Don was the one who came up with the idea and called me up to suggest that we do the company. So for all of those things, thank you, Don.
Jakob. So in the next video, we're going to hear from Jeff Elman. As I mentioned earlier, Jeff was really behind the scenes in helping form the design lab. And Jeff has a long and distinguished history at UCSD. He is chair of cognitive science, dean of social sciences, and he now co-directs the new Data Sciences Institute. He's an internationally recognized scholar, and among his many honors is the Rumelhart Prize that was created in tribute to Dave Rumelhart by Bob Glushko and Pamela Samuelson, to recognize fundamental contributions to the foundations of cognition. Thank you, Bob.
Don, I'm really sorry not to be able to be there in person, but I hope this video succeeds in conveying some of the tremendous admiration and gratitude I feel for you. There's no question in my mind that you've played a central role in my own career, and more importantly, the creation of the community and the field that have enabled so many of us to accomplish the things that we have. Don has made a daunting number of seminal contributions in many fields. He's also had a huge impact through the students that he's mentored who have gone on to make outstanding achievements of their own. I know that some of the panelists will be talking about these contributions. I want to focus on the role that Don has played both through his activities at UCSD as well as the creation of the new field of cognitive science in reshaping how one does science. Jim and others have touched on this already, So what follows is just my own personal understanding of that role. Let me begin with a little bit of background. I first met Don in 1977, shortly after I had arrived at UCSD as an assistant professor in the linguistics department. At that time, the linguistics and psychology departments shared a building, what was then called 2C, because it was on the second college, we now call Muir, and it was the third building in that college. That building is now known as McGill Hall. Now, in fact, the fact that psychology and linguistics shared a building represented more of a pipe dream about interaction than reality. There was, in fact, very little interaction between the two departments. And when I got here, I was very disappointed in this because my PhD had been in linguistics, but I had worked really closely with psychologists during my graduate career. At some point, someone suggested I should go over to the LNR lab. This was the Lindsay Norman Rumelhart lab. I'd heard that there were interesting people there, and they were very likely to be open to misfits like me. My first recollection of Don was actually pretty scary. I sat in on a practice advancement exam from one of the graduate students. No sooner had the candidate put up his first overhead, this was before PowerPoints, when Don interrupted angrily saying, "I can't read what's on the slide. It's too small. You should never use anything less than 18 point and preferably 24. And then he stormed out of the room. Now, I have to admit that the storming out of the room part is probably a reconstructed memory developed over 40 years, reflecting the passion of the moment rather than the reality. Although I was surprised and confused at the passion, I came to realize that Don's point had very little to do with the size of the print. His point was that giving a talk is not about you, it's about the audience. You need to put yourself in their shoes. Your job is to say and show them what they need to know to understand what you're trying to get across. It's actually a very deep insight, but it's unfortunately rarely articulated. It's something that you might call user-centered communication. The LNR lab was an extraordinarily exciting place, and it was exciting because this was where the crazy people hung out. It was a collection of misfits. It's where the psychologists, the linguists, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the computer scientists, the physicists, the biologists, the philosophers, many others came together to try to understand cognition. How does the mind work? And a big part of this involved a commitment to mutual education. Everyone spoke a different language, but there was a recognition that we needed to become at least basically multilingual so that we could talk to each other and establish common ground. As an aside, this is where my anecdote about Don's mania for type size and his commitment to user-centered communication really was so critical. We needed to work really hard to make sure that those who did not understand or share the same vocabulary or assumptions could talk together profitably. Today, we tend to take for granted that interdisciplinarity is a necessary tool. But the reality is this idea was not in the mainstream in those days, either in academia in general or at UCSD. Most scholars and scientists did their work comfortably within their bounds of their own disciplines, rarely feeling the need or value of interacting with others outside their fields. But by the 1970s, it became clear that many of the questions that people who were interested in intelligent behavior, whether it be within brains or within social groups, would require a much more expansive view of the tools, the theories, and the assumptions that were available within any single discipline. And it led to very fruitful interactions on this campus between scholars in anthropology, sociology, psychology, and the other disciplines I've mentioned. The problem was that there was no shared forum or space within which these conversations could take place. Many people played indispensable roles in the creation of this new forum, but I have no doubt that it was Don's vision and drive that actually brought it to fruition. It was a process that unfolded over a period of at least a decade, starting with the transformation of the Elman lab into the CSL lab and then the Institute for Cognitive Science. It brought people like Ed Hutchins, Jim Hollan, Jeff Hinton, Paul Smolenski, and many others to this campus. In 1978, this nucleus, this group, hosted the first international conference on cognitive science, which then became the first annual meeting of the new Cognitive Science Society. This was followed by the creation of the interdisciplinary PhD program in cognitive science, and a few years later by the establishment of the Cognitive Science Department, the first of its kind in the world. As I said, these developments were the product of a community of scholars, and none of this would have happened without that community. But I don't think it diminishes their contributions to say that this probably would not have happened without Don's vision or leadership. Today, virtually every new initiative on this campus, but indeed every new national funding initiative, international conference, announcement of a new journal, whatever, is peppered with reference to being interdisciplinary. And we take it for granted. We take it for granted that it's always been this way, at least at UCSD. My point is that it wasn't. There were a few pioneers, a few visionaries, a few people with crazy ideas and the stubbornness to pursue them that had a transformative effect on our cultural assumptions about both scholarship and education. Don was one of those crazy visionaries. Don, you've had a huge impact on many fields, many institutions, and many people. I count myself as fortunate to have arrived at UCSD in 1977 as an assistant professor and have had the wonderful luck to have benefited from your leadership and vision. I'm a strong believer that environment plays a significant role in whatever we achieve, and there's no question in my mind that my own accomplishments and achievements were made possible because of the environment that you helped to create here. The fact that I remained at UCSD for 41 years is primarily because of this environment. Thank you.
So what a wonderful, touching, and so Jeff in so many ways, both by the brilliance of what he has to say, his insightfulness, but also having, not being able to hear anything. But late yesterday, I have a revision of the video. I said the first Cognitive Science Conference was in 1978. It was really in 1979. I re-edited the video and put a speech bubble to let people know that. So now I have the honor and really incredible pleasure of introducing the members of our first panel. And I'm going to, as I said before, I'm going to introduce all of them to begin with, and then we'll bring them on stage. First two are Bob Glushko and Jonathan Grudin. Both received their PhDs here before the founding of the Cognitive Science Department. Bob is a researcher, an entrepreneur, a business leader, founder of multiple companies, professor at some, lesser known UC up north, and an amazingly generous supporter of the field of cognitive science and the design lab. He is well known not only for his innovations in business-to-business electronic transactions, but for his book, The Discipline of Organizing. Don characterized Bob's book as, quote, the book that changed his view of organizing as the dull, tedious task of putting things in order into thinking of it as the marvelous study of how people add structure to things. So Bob's going to be one of our panelists. Jonathan Grudin has been a close friend since the time he was a graduate student here. He's currently a researcher at Microsoft Research, focused currently on education. He has worked in a surprising number of countries, if you look at his resume. England, Denmark, Japan, Norway, and that strange country-sized place in the U.S. called Texas, where he worked with me in a large HCI lab. I remember, and I didn't know if I should put this in, but I hope I don't embarrass Jonathan, but I was writing, Jonathan was coming up for tenure at UC Irvine, and we had a couple of exchanges, and I was writing a letter for him. But what I really remember from that period is an email chat in which he said something like the following, and I was super impressed by this and actually surprised by it. He said, "I know if I don't get tenure, I will have a more interesting life." And I can't tell you how much that hit me. It's sort of like, that's a mature person, thinking about this. And of course he did both. He got tenure and then shortly after left Irvine for Microsoft Research. He's an amazingly original and utterly tenacious researcher and a prolific writer. I highly recommend his recent book, From Tool to Partner, The Evolution of Human-Computer Interaction. So Jonathan's going to be one of our panelists. Ed Hutchins has been a close collaborator and colleague for many decades, those 4 decades I've been here. We worked together on a series of research projects and shared multiple labs. One was the Intelligent Systems Lab we shared with Don in the Institute for Cognitive Science. And later, after my extreme foolishness of leaving UCSD for a period, when I returned, we jointly created the Distributed Cognition and HCI Lab in the Cognitive Science Department. Ed has deep ties to UCSD. He and Donna, his wife, were undergraduates here. His sister was in the first UCSD graduating class. He got his PhD in anthropology here. He was a postdoc here with Don and was one of the founding faculty of the Cognitive Science Department. I have perhaps learned more from him than from anyone with whom I've ever worked. He's a MacArthur Fellow. This is a fantastic award, commonly known as the Genius Award, with absolutely no restrictions on the award. It was designed to give especially creative people increased independence. I think back fondly of taking Ed to pick up his first major purchase with the award money, a 4-wheel drive truck for surfing in Mexico. More seriously, Ed's book, Cognition in the Wild, has had massive impact on the field. It provides a radically new view of cognition as a system of distributed, socially situated activity that exploits the extraordinary facilities of culture, language, technology, and embodied interaction with the world. Such a view is absolutely fundamental for the future of design. So Ed will be one of our panelists. Dan Russell is another longtime friend. I have known Dan since early days at Xerox PARC. He's especially well known for his work on sense making. He worked with Don at Apple and is now a senior research scientist at Google, where he focuses on search quality, and I love this, user happiness. He is the person to whom both Don and I lodge all our complaints about any problem with Google and software. I recently had breakfast and lunch with Dan in Montreal and took opportunity to complain about my Google Pixel phone. Dan describes his job, and I love this description, as I write, I analyze, I experiment, I do field studies, and I try to understand what makes Google users tick. You may know him from his blog, Search Research, about how to be a better searcher. If you don't know this blog, you should. Don and others have convinced Dan to write a book about this important topic, and he's in the process of doing that. It's tentatively titled The Joy of Finding Out. So Dan will be one of our panelists. Luz Gerber is a professor of design at Northwestern and founder of Design for America. Design for America is described as an idea incubator, a motivated community, and a way of approaching complicated changes using design thinking. We just had some students from the local UCSD Design for America group present in Design Lab research meeting just this week. The ambitious goal of Design for America is to shape the next generation of social innovators. This year, Design for America was recognized by Cooper Hewitt with the prestigious 2018 National Design Award for Corporate and Institutional Achievement. Liz's research is on what is termed collective innovation, but I really like the way she more informally characterized it because it captures her style. Liz writes, and I quote, "It takes a village to raise a kid. Parents alone can't do it. Mentors provide kids with new perspectives. Schools teach math and English. Friends give advice and support. Instead of raising children, I think about raising ideas. We need new ideas to help save our planet, keep health care accessible, and strengthen democracy. To raise those ideas, I create villages." When Don held the Breed Chair of Design at Northwestern, Liz held the Breed Junior Chair of Design. Like Don, she acknowledges no disciplinary boundary. She has faculty appointments in the Segal Design Institute, Mechanical Engineering, Technology and Social Behavior, Industrial Engineering and Management Science, Management and Organizations, Learning Sciences, Electrical Engineering, and Computer Science. Every time I think of faculty we should recruit to the design lab, Liz is at the top of my list. So we're incredibly fortunate to have this group of people who have been impacted by Don and in turn have impacted the world. So I'm going to invite them up, and we're going to go roughly in chronological order. The old graybeard Bob Glushko will lead off, and then Jonathan Grudin, and then Dan Russell, and then Ed Hutchins.
I think there's more than one graybeard in the room.
But yeah, that's true.
And they'd be the most distinguished looking of them.
That could well be.
Well, we are all here to honor Don Norman, but it is a real honor to be asked to be one of the honorers. I think I've known Don longer than anyone on the panel. I met him in late 1973. Where's Don, by the way? Okay, there he is. Okay. I met Don in late 1973. I was an undergraduate at Stanford, and Don was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. I sent him a letter, a physical letter, because we didn't have email, asking to meet with him because I was applying to UCSD cognitive psychology to be a graduate student the following year. I didn't expect to get a letter back. I got a letter back saying, "Come on up to the Hill and talk to me." First I was astonished and I was a little frightened. But I made the trek, and I must have said something okay because I got admitted to UCSD as a graduate student. And I spent the late 70s in the Norman Rummelhart McClellan lab in what we then called Building 2C Prime, which is now called Mandler Hall. So I'm going to build on one of the themes that Jim mentioned, that is that Don has had a hard time standing still. His amazing career is certainly characterized by what I would call zigzagging from one place or kind of career choice to another. And I remember hearing, Don left UCSD for Apple. Then I remember a few years later, Don left Apple for someplace else. Oh, no, then Don has a consulting company. No, Don is retired. No, he's back at academia in Chicago. No, he's retired. No, he's unretired and he's back at San Diego. Now, Don, you could have saved a lot of stress and moving if you just stayed at UCSD that whole time. You could still have a party today. The chancellor would still be saying, "You've been here for 50 so many years. It's great to have you been around for such a long time." But then you wouldn't have had so much fun being a provocateur. And I guess I want to think that I had some role in helping you become a provocateur. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. In 1981, Don wrote a memo, probably on some bad afternoon. He was having a bad day. He wrote a memo called The Trouble with Unix. And it was a memo that had a lot of good ideas in it, constructive criticism about the design of the Unix command language and the naming conventions and the negative implications for usability. And he sent it to the people in the lab because he wanted to understand how he felt. But someone at UCSD, and I'm pretty sure it was Craig Will, he would have done it. It was either Craig or Jonathan, and Jonathan denied, so it must have been Craig Will. Sent that internal memo and publish it on the Usenet bulletin board, which essentially, well, and it went, in today's vernacular, went viral pretty quickly. And the center of the Unix universe in 1981 was Bell Labs in New Jersey, where I was working at the time. To put it mildly, that memo got a lot of people at Bell Labs very upset. I heard Don described as a heretic, blasphemer, lunatic, and a lot worse things that I'm not going to say here. But you can imagine some of them, what they were. Okay. And I told people I knew Don Norman when I was a grad student. And I said, look, I know he wasn't always a saint to me, but he's no devil. You don't want to burn him at the stake. We should invite him to come talk about his issue, because I think we can learn from him. Now, in fact, most people would have said, no way am I taking an invitation to Bell Lab. They would burn me at the stake. Or they would just be frightened to defend their... But Don knew he was right, because he was right. Don is never in doubt. And he was right. So I invited Don to Bell Labs to give a talk. Not just one, I think he gave 2 or 3 of them into packed auditoriums. And we didn't burn him at the stake. In fact, people were like, wow, this dude is kind of making sense. And Don liked that feeling of going into the valley of the shadow of death and coming out the other side. And I think Don's visit to Bell Labs was a landmark event in the history of computing, and it really was the launch point for the field of user-centered design. Don soon became notoriously popular, and I want to emphasize both those words, notorious and popular, in his new role as this eminent research cognitive scientist who also had this altered ego dark side as the design critic. Okay? But let me give some specific evidence to back up that claim that this was a landmark event. Not long after Don's visit to Bell Labs, one of the top research groups at Bell Labs that had the strongest concentration of cognitive psychologists were kind of encouraged to fix some of these issues that shut Norman up, And so we saw Tom Landauer, Sue Dumais, George Furness, people like that, all of a sudden spending some time doing research on command language design and vocabulary problems and human interaction. It wasn't a coincidence. Okay? Don convinced them that it was an important issue. And then within a year, that kind of work was prominent in the first conference on human factors of computer systems. It's the forerunner of the Chi conference in 1982. Now, Don didn't organize that conference. He didn't have to, because the people... Are we being recorded? Okay. The person who organized this conference was Ben Schneiderman. Now, Ben Schneiderman, those of us who know him, was very envious of Don's notoriety about this, all the things that happened. Don's now a notorious design critic, and Ben thought he wanted some of that, so he started this conference. Now, I can defer to John Grudin, our historian of Chi. Is that a reasonable interpretation that this sort of might have been one of the motivations behind that conference?
We'll let it pass.
Okay. So I think we've passed the truthiness test that Don influenced the field in ways that he didn't even realize. So Don started writing popular books to spread this new gospel. His first book, User-Centered System Design, which of course was given that title because of the UCSD. First, it makes me grateful he wasn't at Berkeley or UCLA, because I couldn't figure out how to back-propagate a name from that anyway to make it design anything. And if he had been at UCLA, we'd have some really weird name of design language literacy. I don't know what it would have been. All right? And so it would have set the field back decades if he'd been at some other school, because it wouldn't have the right acronym. Because names are important. Don has always said naming is important. Right? Which reminds me, Don's second and most popular book ever, which most of you know was The Design of Everyday Things, was actually misnamed the first time out. It was called The Psychology of Everyday Things. And so bookstores put it in the self-help department. And until they changed the name, no one would buy it. They thought it was a book on being, good with yourself, or actualizing, or whatever it was. So until we changed the name, it wasn't. So the thing is, I actually have both of them. I think I actually have 4 or 5 of them, because whenever they change the cover, I have to buy the new cover of The Design of Everyday Things, because I like them. In fact, I'm not sure how many books Don has written, but I counted 9 yesterday in my library. So
20.
I have 9 different ones, including one with this about taillights being the faces of cars or something weird like that. Oh, okay. Now, the trouble with Norman, sorry, I couldn't help myself saying that. The trouble with Norman is that when he's been the most effective and convincing, when the people or systems that he's criticizing and disrupting come around because they figured he was right, and they change their behaviors or designs, the new equilibrium Don has created makes him bored. He's got to go disrupt something else. So Don had to go to Apple in 1993 to disrupt Apple. Now, got there just about the same time I got to Silicon Valley. I was the co-founder of a company called Passage Systems. And it's not uncommon today for professors to go hang out in Silicon Valley or start their companies here at, whatever the equivalent here of Silicon Valley is. Qualcomm Valley or something? I don't know. And it's not uncommon to have a foot in industry, but back then it was a pioneering and courageous thing to do. Unless you have done it, you really can't appreciate how wildly different the university and the real world are in terms of how people are organized, the kind of things they work on, the time constraints and resource constraints they have to deal with, and so on. And I think that Don's move to Apple inspired a lot of academics to go over the wall. That was a really important thing also that influenced it. People said, I can do this industry thing. I mean, I can be part of this and make a difference. Now, during Don's early years at Apple, we met occasionally to talk about how industry in the Valley worked. And I remember in particular a conversation we had about stock options because Don had a question about how you should value stock compensation as part of your overall compensation package. And I remember saying, whatever you got at Apple is worth a lot more than mine because my company's going to fail. And it did fail. But I'm sure I told Don, never sell any Apple stock until at least 2018. And I'm sure he took that advice, and it's up 10,000% since then. It was a good idea at the time. Okay. All right. Now, I think that the rest of the story will be told by John and a few other people, but I have a couple of more personal things to say. Just a month or so ago in my class at Berkeley, I was explaining how we've changed our thinking about human cognition from the early days, the early metaphor of the human serial information processor. And I showed a diagram from my first Norman book, Human Information Processing, the Lindsay Norman book, to show the kind of pipeline processing serial processor. And one of my students says, is that the same Don Norman whose books we read in our UX course? That's impossible. Those two fields are too far apart. And I said, not if you invented both of them. And I felt so smug saying that I know Don Norman. I felt so to be able to name drop. It was so cool, right, to be able to do that. But finally I have a confession to make about something that I felt guilty about since 1981 when I invited Don to Bell Labs. I'd never invited anyone before, professionally, and I didn't know about the concept of an honorarium, which is, of course, what you do when you get invited to give talks to a place like that. So Don said, well, do I get an honorarium? I said, what's an honorarium? So I asked my management, can I give him an honorarium? He said, Bell Labs don't do honorarium. It's an honorarium to come here. You should be honored to get invited to Bell Labs. And I thought, oh, that's bad. I felt so terrible. And I felt bad every time I think about it since then. So today I'm very happy to say that I recently gave UCSD some money to honor Don Norman. And Don, I hope that $250,000 seems about right for an honorarium plus interest for 37 years. Okay, am I up hook now? Okay, good, all right. So again, it is a great honor to be here today to be one of the honorers, but we're here to honor Don Norman, so thank you very much.
So following Bob Glushko, I knew I was in trouble when I found I was going to be following Bob Glushko here. And although Don prefers to look to the future, I prepared remarks that will also cover the past. Some of them will fill out details of what has been said, and some of it may repeat an item or two, but as we know, if we've studied memory, repetition has value as well. So I first, and the introductions also, since I first met Don in 1976, I've now been described as one of the misfits that that Jeff Elman encountered when he got here, and also I've also, because I got tenure and even stayed around to become a full professor, I've led this somewhat less interesting life than I might have. But I did first meet Don in 1976 when he gave a lecture at Stanford where I was deciding where to go to graduate school. MIT, UCSD, or stay at Stanford. And in case Don's talk didn't convince me, UCSD assigned a graduate student to phone me up. And that graduate student was Bob Glushko, also formerly from Stanford. When I told my Stanford mentor, Ed Smith, my decision, he said, "Great. UCSD is about discovery. Stanford is about power." And not long after, Ed left Stanford. So when I got here, Don had assembled a remarkable lab with possibly the best computer facilities at UCSD, including a rare ARPANET connection via a leased line to the Naval Ocean Systems Center in Point Loma. Point Loma is also where Jim Hollan and Ed Hutchins were, two researchers who inspired us graduate students. But it was the intellectual environment, as people have been saying, that made this an amazing place from 1977 to, between 1977 and 1981. So we were at the center of this extension, so at the epicenter of this extension of cognitive psychology into cognitive science. And Don was a rare case of an established leader in a field who led rather than resisted a radical change. His psychology books, Memory and Attention, and Human Information Processing were widely used in psychology courses, and the book Explorations in Cognition had just been published by Don and Dave Rummelhart and a recent cohort of their graduate students in the psychology field. The Sloan Foundation, as Jim mentioned, or as Scott mentioned briefly, had successfully created the field of neuroscience and was launching cognitive science with our lab as one of 3 or 4 national hubs. And to sort of review what was happening at that time and Don's role in it, the journal Cognitive Science began publishing in 1977. In 1978, Don joined the editorial board of the Harvard University Press's Cognitive Science series. In 1979, he became the editor of the even more influential Erlbaum Cognitive Science book series. That same year, as has been mentioned, he was the founder and first secretary-treasurer of the Cognitive Science Society, later becoming its president. And in 1981, he became the editor of the Cognitive Science Journal. And so then, of course, as we've heard, he went on to found the first cognitive science department here. And in 1979, as Jeff Elman recalled, the first cognitive science conference was held in Muir campus here. And an incident that I treasure from that conference came during the evening opening reception when Craig Will, another of Don's graduate students who was mentioned, when Craig Will and I lured Norman Geschwind to leave the party, walk to our lab, and help us dissect a dolphin brain that we had extracted that we had obtained from and extracted from the nearby marine fisheries station. We were looking for hemispheric differences in the linguistically capable dolphin species. So you could never predict where this discovery of these wild activities around here would take us. So again, it was during those 4 years that Dave Rummelhart and Jay McClellan, but also Don was centrally involved, or was heavily involved in the launching of along with Jeff Hinton and the others who were mentioned in the development of the foundations for parallel distributed processing, or connectionism, or neural nets, or machine learning, or deep learning. You can choose the names. But also during that time, Mike Cole arrived and established the Laboratory for Comparative Human Cognition, and several of us worked with Mike. And my friend Naomi Miyake's thesis was co-advised by both Don and Mike Cole, whereas mine was just solely Don with Jeff Elman on my committee. So Jeff Elman actually agreed to be on the PhD committees of lots of the misfits that he met over here. So finally, in those years, as we've been hearing, the field of human-computer interaction was forming, and cognitive science was at its center at the beginning. And Don's students and postdocs were, from the outset, they were the strongest academic contributors to that effort. And In the decades that followed, Don repeatedly anticipated and guided the direction of change in that rapidly growing field. So in 1983 in Boston, he gave the first paper at the first Computer Interaction, Human Interaction, or CHI conference, in which he brought engineering approaches to a field in need of a solid foundation at that time. The 1986 book, User-Centered System Design, that's been mentioned by Jim and Bob, compiled work from the group here that was so insightful that it remained a useful source for years after the other earlier work in this field. In his book, in 1988, his book, The Psychology of Everyday Things, it did actually make a big impact before the name changed, at least in the field of HCI, but it significantly led a shift in approach to away from more formal methods to evidence-based sort of sensible prescriptions built on observed patterns of human behavior, which others have remarked is one of Don's trademarks. And then when the book was reissued in 1990 as The Design of Everyday Things, it also reflected another change, which was, although the book was not entirely about digital objects, the declining price of memory and processing enabled a shift in HCI to more complex designs, including visual design, which had just been too expensive before that. And that was notably reflected in Apple, in the products of Apple Computer, where Don was from 93 to 97. Then Don's book, Emotional Design, presaged another broadening of the field from perceptual and cognitive aspects of work to a more full engagement with all aspects of our lives, socially, just slightly before social media took off. And so these were all major transitions in a continually expanding and evolving field. Okay, now I want you to imagine up here a slide that I didn't bring. It's an image of a surfer on a high breaking wave. I have this slide, but we decided not to use slides. On a high breaking wave, which is a metaphor for human-computer interaction research in the dynamic reign of Moore's Law. Don has been on the leading edge of that wave for decades, an inspiration for generations of researchers, developers, and designers. And so a personal note, after I left UCSD 37 years ago, Don and I co-authored a few papers, including one of my favorites that was inspired by a paper that I was assigned to read in a UCSD linguistics class. But more significantly, our paths have crossed frequently over the years, and we've talked and corresponded often at great length. And a constant through that time has been that even that I'm curious and eclectic, but Don is even more relentlessly curious, as we've heard. So I could always ask or tell him about something that interested me and be confident that he would have an informed opinion. And sometimes he had two informed opinions on the issue, and they didn't always agree with each other. But it was a guarantee that I could hear back something of interest. He was a great advisor, and he's been an inspiration through his work, and which are in a way external virtues. But inside my world, as I moved from job to job and country to country, and from single to married with a daughter who's now here at UCSD, an invaluable constant for me was knowing that Don is out there and will always have something to say. Knowing that has made my life brighter. So thank you, Don.
I'm really next. I'm really next. All right. All right. Exactly. I just want to get to the right part. So I'm Dan Russell. I've known Don ever since we overlapped at Apple. But I think you have to admire somebody whose Wikipedia entry says, and I quote, "This biography of a living person relies too much on references to primary resources." this suggests there's a giant number of primary resources, right? You have to actually admire that. That's a quality I don't have. But I actually have to tell you first about this quintessentially Don Norman moment, the Norman-esque moment I had this morning coming here, which is I got my new laptop, which has the new USB-C power connectors. Of course, they also do video. They do basically everything, which is great. I left my power supply at home, and I wanted to be sure I had enough power here to actually give my presentation. So I thought, oh, I'll go to the little store, and I'll buy a USB-C power supply. And I did that, and I plug it in, and I thought, oh, this is great. It's at 53%. I edit for a little bit, and as I'm unplugging it, I realize it's at 47%, even though the little icon says it's charging. What went wrong? You can see why Don would love this, right? I bought a power supply that's draining power from my battery. So what happened? What happened is that the thing I bought was a cell phone power supply that has a USB-C connector. It plugs in. Now, as you know, probably Don has a long and fraught relationship with power supplies, right? I mean, I've heard him talk a lot about why is it so stupid that we do X or Y or Q, whatever. So this is an interesting moment. It's now you have to check to see how many amps it provides. So we solved the problem of connectors, but now you have to read the specs to make sure you've got the right power supply. So this is not a Norman-esque improvement, right? In many ways, this is going backwards in time. Whereas Don might say, really? Although he would probably say a few more things. Now, I bring this up because both Don and I worked at Apple together. And so I heard a lot of his fights with the various designers and power systems and laptops, and it's an interesting, complex topic. It's more sophisticated than you might think, more complex than you might think. But we were both at Apple from 1993 until 97. Now, I got there just like a couple weeks before Don arrived. And I left a little bit after Don left. I think he left to go to HP at the time. And Don was much smarter than I was because he left, I stayed, and only a couple months after Don left, Steve Jobs nuked all of research, which means I had to lay off all those people. Thanks, Don. I appreciate that. But that's a lot more insight than I had at the time, so I wish I had that level of understanding. So you have to understand now, to cast your mind back to 97. It was a really interesting time because it was the dawn of the commercial internet. Yes, the internet had been around for a while. There were imps and there were processors down here and so on. But this was when companies were coming online for the first time. And so we remember having these arguments about, should we bring up www.apple.com? So I asked Don, should I do that? He said, I don't know. Why don't you give it a try? So I did that, and I actually went off and bought the domain name apple.com because there was nobody to do that at Apple. And so I figured it out, and I paid my $30, whatever it was, and I ultimately transferred it and gave it back to Apple. But it was an interesting time because at Apple, there was an internal walled garden thing called eWorld. And I remember having these knockdown, drag-out fights with the guys at eWorld saying, we want to put Apple content onto apple.com. And they would say, and this is a direct quote, the internet is a passing fancy. It will go away. Said the CEO of a thing called eWorld, which of course you all remember, right, as a passing fancy. But it was a very different time, right? And so a lot of my interactions with Don were of the form, gee, Don, what would happen if we did this? Is this an interesting research topic to do? So one of the things that was happening in the late 90s was the advent of very large displays. Now, of course, we think of a display like, say, this one as normal. But back then, we were working at VGA, 640 by 480 pixels, at roughly 72 dots per inch. And all of a sudden, we got into our lab a DPIX display, which was, I think, 41 dots per millimeter. Okay, do the math. So we got together, we sort of worked in the lab to plug that Mac video output into this fancy display output. And of course, when you do this, it's this big, and it's, at roughly 1,000 dpi, right? So the entire Mac OS window is this big. You think you have problems with fonts on slides. The title of the Finder was roughly 0.5 millimeter high. This is a real problem. And I told Don about this, and he said, well, what did you expect? That's when we realized that Apple had hard-coded constants into all the display routines, because nobody thought that we'd be changing. But this was a time of great change. The internet became commercial. Online services were one of the things that were happening. All of a sudden, we had to put variables in for things like spots per inch on the display. We also were doing things like building tabletop displays, and I have a fantastic picture, like Jonathan's picture. Imagine Don leaning over on a tabletop display like this, looking at it as we were trying to figure out what to do with it. I showed it to Don, and he said to me, well, how many will you sell? What's the market for this? And I thought, well, this is a research project. And he said, I hope you remember this, Don, because these are words that are sort of inscribed on my cerebellum. Is this a research aspiration, or is it a market investigation? Right? And I thought you were an academic. But I realized that Don was going through this transformation, as I was, and I think a lot of us in the field were. We were understanding that all of a sudden this kind of system building was much more complicated than we had thought from an academic computer science perspective. And so when Don was at Apple, he worked on things like the original Apple digital camera, the Quick Take. Anybody remember that? Yeah, no you don't. You also worked on things like the Kodak Smart Frame, Smart Picture Frame. There's a lot of products that you no longer know about because they failed miserably. And there's a lesson there, right? So one of Don's profound takeaway lessons is that products and services do not exist in isolation. They need a supportive ecosystem. They need a supportive operational environment. So in addition, they need to have a compelling user experience that adds value to the end consumer, to the user of this thing. You're not just designing a thing, which happens a lot in academics, right? I design a thing that exists in isolation, but you're actually designing a new organism that has to live and survive in an ecosystem. And that's a profound impact for me. So one of the things that I love about working with Don was he would ask these great questions, provocative questions like, and this is a true thing, this is all true stories, by the way, but he said to me one day, why does my urinal know more about me than my laptop? I said, really? What do you mean? Well, he said, it flushes when I walk away. My laptop doesn't know that I'm there at all. So we had some sensors lying around, so we wired them in, and we started wiring sensors into things like our room, so we knew if somebody was in the room, motion sensors, all that stuff, right? So one of the things we did was to build a presence detector so that when you walked away, it would go to screensaver. It would log you out effectively, so nobody could come in and just cheese your computer. I don't know if you know this, Don, but one of the first things we did actually when we had the presence detection system was when you walked away, it would go to a screensaver and it would flush. It was an internal joke up until this very moment. Now you know the truth of this. So we had this sort of interesting set of questions that Don would keep asking us, and we would try to answer them the best way we could. So one of my jobs was to work with Don, and one of my joys working with Don was he would ask me a question like, how do I do this? How do I change the font or the frame or the indentation or whatever? And I would say, Don, you click on that. And then, of course, he would say, why would anybody click on that to achieve that effect? Right? And then when we would have this conversation about mental models, and the mental model of the developer is not the same as the end user, and vice versa. And so a lot of our conversations were how to get that to happen. Now, one of the things that Don also said to me was, I remember this one as well. You said, we were walking back from a lab meeting, and you said, I don't get it. This is Don speaking. I don't understand why people overinterpret everything I say. Why do they take it so seriously? I'm just telling them what I think, right? And I explained to you that you were a senior VP at the time, and I think you were newly a senior VP at the time. And I said, you remember how in the Soviet era there was Kremlinology? Now there's Normanology. There are people, because you're senior VP, whose lives and work depend critically on everything you say. So of course they're going to interpret what you say very, very, very carefully. And I remember you kind of looked, very interesting moment. So I thought that was obvious. But, fast forward a couple of years, and this is sort of my key point for today, is that I was teaching a class on how to be a better searcher. I do this a lot. And I was teaching at the museum right around the corner from your house. And you came without telling me and came and stood in the back and watched the last, hour and a half of my class. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So at the end, all the students walk away and we chat for a little bit. And of course, Don says the first thing, you're doing this all wrong. And I thought, well, okay. So I listened to you. And damn it, he was right. And so I took what you told me and incorporated that into everything I have taught since then. In particular, that style of teaching, that way of confronting this knowledge that you don't have, that you need to operationalize, how to teach effectively to students became part of everything I have done since then, including my MOOC, which has had at this point around 4 million students go through it, which means ultimately that Don's influence through all the mechanisms we've been talking about is profound intellectually, academically, and it influences millions of people in ways that he might not have thought about. But it's one of these things, where even to this day, I find myself fighting for the Norman perspective. At Google, for example, recently I had to say why we should not put up a pop-up message that says, we have classified this email as spam because of Google Magic. If you're going to explain something, it has to connect. It has to make sense in that context. And so while I'm not an SVP or a user experience architect at Google like Don was at Apple, the lessons I have learned from Don have stuck with me, and ultimately through our work have influenced millions and millions of people. Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Ed Hutchins. A lot of people have talked about Don's insights and his ideas. I want to mention his generosity. I think one of Don's greatest talents has been creating the conditions for paradigm-changing scientific progress. And looking back over my own career, I've discovered that I've spent most of my academic career in institutional settings that were created by Don Norman. It turns out that Don and I both arrived at UCSD in the same year, 1966. He came as a faculty member and I was a clueless freshman. I didn't really meet Don until 6 years later in 1972 when I was a graduate student in anthropology, and my advisor, Roy Dondrati, like Jeff Elman's advisor, said, you should go hang out in the LNR lab. So I did. So I went over in 1972 and started hanging out in the LNR lab in psychology. And as was mentioned before, that was just as the work that became the foundational book, Explorations in Cognition, that's when this book was being written. Between 72 and 75, I think publication date was 75 or 76. A great bunch of graduate students there, and Don and Dave Romelhart made it possible for them to pull together a coherent story about schema theory and semantic networks. And those of you who were there at that time will know what I mean, that that book did cause change. I was only a peripheral participant in that lab, not being a psychologist. I was just visiting from anthropology, but I think I absorbed the lessons, and in 1975 I went off to Papua New Guinea to do my own PhD research, and I believe I did the very first application of schema theory to discourse in a non-Western society in a non-Indo-European language. And Don bravely was a member of my thesis committee when I came back and wrote up my thesis. So I owe Don a lot for getting me a thesis topic and helping me off into the field. By the late 70s, Don, as been mentioned, was one of the authors of this important Sloan Foundation report on cognitive science that basically was an articulation of the idea that an interdiscipline called cognitive science was possible. And the Sloan Foundation provided generous funding, as was mentioned. Don and Dave Rummelhart had a postdoc program here at UCSD. The Sloan Fellows included Len Talmy, who's a famous linguist at Berkeley, Chris Riesbeck, a computer scientist from Yale, later at Northwestern, Bernie Bars, Ian Moore, me, the anthropologist, James Anderson from Brown, James Brown, yes. And a young computer scientist named Jeff Hinton, who I got to know, and Jeff and I actually co-authored a paper on Micronesian navigation, and although Jeff is known for his work in deep learning, he often still wins a beer by betting people that he published a paper on tropical archaeoastronomy. As was mentioned, because of Don, the inaugural meeting of the Cognitive Science Society took place here in the summer of 1979. Also that summer, Don helped Jim Anderson and Jeff Hinton convene a meeting of early connectionists. And from that meeting came the book called Parallel Models of Associative Memory, which was published in 1981 and actually served as a building block for the subsequent work, the Parallel Distributed Processing 2-volume set, so-called Bible of Connectionism, which was also written here. I know this event is about Don, but I have to acknowledge my friend Jim Hollan at this moment in the history. I had, by the time I graduated in anthropology, become too much of a psychologist to be hired by an anthropology department, and too much of an anthropologist to be hired by a psychology department. And when I finished my postdoc, it was even worse, and Jim hired me to work in his Navy-funded lab. And I'll say this, Don has had the vision to create, and I'm describing for you many contexts where this paradigm-changing work gets done, and Jim is the other person I know who can do that. And I think this bodes well for the future of the design lab. With Jim, we put together this revolutionary steamer project. If you've ever worked with a graphical interface, and I think some of you have, well, we were there in 1980, and it's also gave me the opportunity to get aboard Navy ships and study navigation, which became my book, Cognition in the Wild. By the early or mid-1980s, the PDP group was working in parallel. Don led our user-centered system design group. You've heard about it several times now. That book really was a seminal book, the UCSD book. Around that time also, Don established the Institute for Cognitive Science, which housed the Cognitive Science Interdisciplinary Program. We really had a graduate program before there was a department. And we're educating students, taking courses in a number of departments here on campus. Don and ICS gave me a home as a research professor when I quit working for the Navy in 1985. In the late 1980s, through the work of a whole community, but Don was at the center of it, establishing the Cognitive Science Department here at UCSD. And you've heard it's the first of its kind in the world. It was the first cognitive science department that wasn't cognitive and brain sciences and that offered both undergraduate and graduate degrees. Watching from just down the hall, it seemed to me that Don dedicated the entirety of the 1986 to 87 academic year building a department. I don't think he had time to do much else. It was amazing, and we benefited from that, of course. Don drew on existing campus faculty, including Liz Bates and Jean Mandler from psychology, Jeff Elman, whom you heard, and Gilles Fauconnier from linguistics, Aaron Sickerill from sociology, and a few people that he called odd ducks, who were people in or around campus who had fallen between the cracks of the established disciplines and were looking for an institutional home. This included a neuroimager named Helen Neville, a computational neurobiologist named David Zipser, who was an important player in the PDP books, the electrophysiologist Marta Kudus, now distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Cognitive Science here, and me, saved from imminent obscurity once again by Don Norman. Once the department was up and running, Don delegated to me the job of organizing our first undergraduate curriculum. And as part of that, Don and I together designed a 3-course series that included a course on cognitive ethnography methods, distributed cognition theory, and a design practicum. And Don and I taught that course together for several years until he left in 1993. When we hired Jim in 97, we picked that series up, and Jim and I taught that course together, that whole sequence together for several years, and now it's taught by Taylor Scott, who's sitting right there. The influence of the department, of course, resides in the thousands of students who are out there in the world changing our world. In 1989, Don and I got our first grant from NASA's Aviation Automation Safety Program to study the cognitive consequences of automation in commercial airliners. And my favorite part about that actually was on one of our first visits to NASA Ames, I watched Don crash a 747, simulated, luckily. That research grant was the strip from which my career in aviation human factors took off. As Jim mentioned, Don left UCSD in '93 for Apple, but his vision and influence have reverberated through our department ever since, over the 2 decades of his absence from UCSD. A few years ago, Steve Kasner at NASA Ames and Don and I wrote a paper together on the challenges of automated driving, and we drew on our years of experience with automation in airplanes to try to understand what's happening with automation in cars. And our conclusion is that the auto industry seems determined to recapitulate most of the mistakes that were made in aviation 20 years earlier. It was my pleasure to work in the design lab here on automated cars for a few months in 2015 before going back to the world of airplanes. And as I look over this whole scene, I know that many people have helped me over the course of my career. But on reflection, it's clear that much of the success that I've enjoyed as an academic has come from riding waves that were made by that wave maker there, Don Norman. From the Explorations in Cognition group in the early 70s through the Sloan postdoc program, the Cognitive Science Society, the Institute for Cognitive Science, the UCSD Department of Cognitive Science, and now the Design Lab. Each of those scientific surges has provided me with an excellent ride. So thanks, Don, for a great session.
I love the surfing theme. Building on that, in honor of you, Jim, this morning, I had a go at surfing. It's not easy. So all these references to surfing, being on the wave, thanks Don for doing the hard work. My name is Liz Gerber, and I'm truly honored to be up with this group of speakers. I've been noting the years referenced of when they met you, Don. Many of them I was not yet in this world, so this is an honor to be with these folks. Today what I want to do is celebrate Don, something that I think has been critical to Don's success and his very long and successful career, and that is his attitude of wisdom. So, attitude of wisdom, what is this? Theologian and social activist Thomas Merton described the attitude of wisdom as the ability to act with knowledge while doubting what you know. Such wisdom is critical for leaders who must have the courage to act what is known right now, and the humility to change course when better evidence is found. Having this sense of humility requires being open to and acknowledging your imperfections. Organizational theorist Carl Weick wrote, "Argue like you're right, but listen as if you're wrong." And I think that very much describes much of my experience with Don. Such people who have this attitude of wisdom tend to be very curious. They're always looking for new information to help them realize what they don't know. They also tend to keep their colleagues on their toes, never quite sure which opinion they will be holding strongly on a particular day. So by a show of hands, who has ever been in a meeting with Don when you weren't quite sure what he was going to say? Look around, Don. Come on, Julie, raise your hand. So, my point, Don has strong opinions. For the younger people in the audience, DHSO for short, Don has strong opinions if you ever need to use that. And he has strong opinions about a breadth of topics. We've heard some of them today. He has strong opinions about coffee pots, about caps, notice the lovely one he's wearing right now, and on big topics like healthcare and higher ed. And by having these strong opinions, Don has been able to influence millions, and I think today I heard billions, of people by writing books that inspire us to create everyday objects with respect to other people's mental models rather than our own idiocentric whims. And he's inspired scholarship and design. So now I speak to my personal experience with Don. At the age of 20, I was an intern for Apple designer Jerry Manick, who designed the Apple II computer. I was living in Burlington, Vermont. This was highly unusual that I would find a designer like this. He was the first person to introduce me to Don's strong opinions by gifting me a book, which was called, I believe at that time, The Psychology of Everyday Things. At the time, I had a passion for art, engineering, and psychology, and was struggling to understand how to combine these three passions. That night, I read his book, cover to cover. I was hooked. Not only did Don eloquently explain the critical intersection of engineering and cognitive science, he did so in a style that felt like we were in conversation. He used photos from his own life to illustrate current challenges with telephones, doors, coffee pots, and more. The approachability of your writing, Don, and your examples were remarkable to me. 5 years later, I met Don in person while a doctoral student in the Work, Technology, and Organizations group at Stanford University. During his talk, he spoke of the dangers of boat and airplane cockpit design during emergency responses. At the time, I had just finished reading Harvard team researcher Amy Edmondson's work on the design of teams and the positive relationship between the surgery team's psychological safety and their performance in emergency situations. During Don's talk, I was integrating both Don's point of view and Amy's point of view, and empirical evidence, mind you, about the design of technology and the design of teams on performance to inform my own, what would soon become my own strong opinions on the design of socio-technical organizations. But I'm just one of millions whom Don's strong opinions have influenced. By the time I met Don at Stanford, he had fully established the field of cognitive science, as had been noted, as a legitimate area of academic inquiry and industry concern across the globe. Today, according to the Cognitive Science Society website, there are over 100 cognitive science programs. That's amazing. With the goal of raising the role of design research in the academy, Northwestern's Dean of Engineering, my dean at this time, knew a man named Don who had very strong opinions, was just the person to do this. So in 2006, Dean Otino at Northwestern recruited Don to return to higher education to build the new Design Institute and to hire the new design research faculty to build Northwestern's global reputation in design. As I recall, Don's early effort to recruit me began with a simple invitation in email. Happy New Year. Can we find an hour or two to talk together? As a young graduate student, 41 years his junior, I was terrified. I had not exchanged a single word with Don. While I had read his books, attended his guest lecture, and been deeply influenced by his design, I had, again, not exchanged a single word, opinionated or otherwise, with Don Norman. The nature of our relationship soon changed from academic rock star and fan, he the academic rock star and me the fan, to colleagues. With persuasive and strong arguments about the future of design and life in Chicago, albeit a place where he and Julie escaped every winter, he convinced me to join him at Northwestern. When we taught together that first year, Don learned that I too had strong opinions about experience design. He graciously allowed me to start our class, not with a typical lecture, but with a physical experience to immerse the students in the topic of the day. For the next 4 years, I had the joy of accompanying Don during many engaging academic and industry meetings with academic and industry C-suite leaders. I learned how he carefully listens to other people's point of view while also asserting his own. He successfully convinced our dean to revise the joint program in business and engineering to focus on design, a program that's now considered best in class thanks to Don's leadership. He advocated for new co-curricular interdisciplinary approaches to design education by advising our newly formed Design for America, a national network of design studios that was mentioned earlier, that we now have a group here at UCSD, which is wonderful. He encouraged our network to look at healthcare as a place ripe for design, and this focus has been consistently generative for our students, resulting in many design startups in the Chicago area and beyond. But perhaps most importantly, I'm a mother of 2 children. And when my children were graciously invited over by Julie and Don to their house. My children were 2 and 4 at the time. Don, I'm not sure if you recall this, but you introduced my children to video games, specifically the Wii. Until they grow older and are able to read your books, this is Isabel and Henry's view of your lasting impact. You encouraged them to play video games, and their mother did not. But back to the argument at hand. While many may agree that Don has strong opinions, many that know him well and who have followed his career closely also know that Don is unique in the way that he holds these strong opinions. Don doesn't just have strong opinions, he holds them weakly. This is to say that Don's opinions may be deeply rooted in empirical evidence and experience. He still welcomes new information to reconsider his opinions. And as Don has often qualified when describing me as a misfit, I mean this entirely as a compliment, Don. Experience can often prevent us from having an attitude of wisdom. A person could say, I have 40 years of experience, but it's not really 40 years of experience, it's 1 year repeated 40 times. But Don is so far from a broken record, repeating the same track over and over. Every year, he seems to be adding a new track with new ideas. In his best-selling book, The Design of Everyday Things, Don focused on cognition. 16 years later, he published Emotional Design. In response to his extensive work in industry and research, Don's cognitive approach to design expanded to include an emotional approach. He argued that designers must not only actively consider how a design not only evokes cognitive and behavioral reactions, but also emotional reactions. While at Northwestern, and now more recently at UCSD, I have also witnessed Don's strong opinion about product as the focal unit analysis shift to expand to systems thinking. It's not just enough to design new products, but rather systems in which many products interact. After Don made a former president of RISD, published a book called The Laws of Simplicity in 2006. Don invited John to an intellectual battle, I think is what we called it, where Don wanted to argue for complexity. 2 years later, Don published the book Living with Complexity. But probably what's most amusing to me, once I understood Don's tendency to have strong opinions loosely held, was that when he wrote a provocative Core 77 blog describing design thinking as a bad idea. The blog post caused quite a stir in the design community, who looked to Don as the public and persuasive advocate for design. To date, millions had used Don's writing to ask for more resources for design in their organization, more design classes in their curriculum, and more recognition in engineering, psychology, and other disciplines. I knew at this time, Don still believed in the power of design. This was just his way of continually learning and encouraging not only himself, but also his followers to learn along with him. He later wrote a post saying that design thinking, in fact, was wonderful, and has since scribed a synthesis of these two opinions. I encourage you to read. But Don's strong opinion, weakly held, does not only pertain to design. As has been mentioned many times before, it also pertains to his approach to retirement. After successfully establishing Northwestern's Design Institute, he decided it was time to retire from Northwestern. But this was a strong opinion, also weakly held, as he returned to UC San Diego to launch yet another successful design institute. And even when I asked Jim and Scott about the nature of this particular celebration, as has been mentioned, they told me indeed this is not a retirement party, but rather a non-retirement party. So as we celebrate Don's successful career and strong opinions today, I would like to conclude by highlighting a final opinion of Don's for which I most respect him. Since the day I started working closely with Don, he recognized the critical role that you, Julie, has played in his career. You have been a sounding board for his strong opinions, edited his numerous books, and been a constant companion through his numerous academic and industry travails. Please join me as we celebrate Don and Julie Norman for their immense impact on our own lives and having the courage to act on what is known right now and the humility to change course when better evidence is found. Thank you.
And as absolutely startling as this may be, we're almost exactly on time. How that happened, I will never know. We're going to take a break of 15 or so minutes, and then we're going to reassemble for a second panel that Scott's going to introduce.